Two bombs. One instant surrender. A world divided forever. On the morning of August 6, 1945, an American B-29 named Enola Gay crossed the horizon over Hiroshima and delivered a weapon unlike any the world had seen. 78,000 people were killed that day. Tens of thousands more would die later from burns and radiation. 3 days later, on August 9th, a second bomb struck Nagasaki. Japan surrendered on August 15th. The war that had reshaped continents and cost tens of millions of lives came to an abrupt, cataclysmic halt. But the end was not simple. The decision to use atomic weapons was the culmination of months of secret science, urgent military planning, uncertain diplomacy, and a collision of ethics and strategy. This script tells that story, precise, unsentimental, focused on facts and testimony, and keeps delivering small reveals to hold attention every few minutes. By mid-1945, the United States had built the Manhattan Project, the largest and most expensive research program in history. Scientists, military engineers, and technicians across the country worked in strict secrecy to turn theoretical physics into a deliverable weapon. The project's leaders were driven by urgency. Germany had been the first great worry. By the time the bombs were ready, Germany had surrendered. The new focus was Japan, which still refused unconditional surrender and had fought on despite massive losses. American planners calculated the human cost of a full-scale invasion of Japan and expected millions of casualties on both sides. Those casualty estimates and the need to end the war quickly shaped the choices that followed. The first reveal: the United States faced a binary decision with massive stakes: invade or use the atomic bomb. The military argument for dropping the bomb rested on projections and logistics. Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, had two parts: Olympic and Coronet. Olympic would land in Kyushu in November 1945. Coronet would follow with a final push against the Tokyo Plain in early 1946. Planners predicted fierce resistance from an army that had shown willingness to fight to the last man and mobilization of millions of civilians in homeland defense. Casualty estimates varied wildly. Some military planners predicted several 100,000 American casualties. Others offered numbers in the millions. For many U.S. leaders, the atomic bomb represented a way to force surrender without a bloody invasion. At the same time, diplomacy was in play. The United States was aware of Soviet intentions. The USSR had promised at Yalta to enter the war against Japan after Germany's defeat, and Soviet forces were preparing for an August offensive in Manchuria. Some leaders in Washington believed that an atomic strike might shorten the war and limit Soviet influence in East Asia. Others argued that using the bomb would instead signal American power and harden post-war divisions. President Truman, who had taken office on Roosevelt's death in April 1945, received reports on the bomb's success and faced a choice: demonstrate the weapon's power against an enemy or keep it as a bargaining chip. Revealing detail: top U.S. officials recognized the bomb's diplomatic weight as well as its military one. The bombs themselves were different designs. The bomb used over Hiroshima, code-named Little Boy, was a uranium gun-type weapon. The Nagasaki bomb, Fat Man, used an implosion design with plutonium. The scientific team, led by J. Robert Oppenheimer and a network of laboratories at Los Alamos, Oak Ridge, and Hanford, had produced enough material and drawn up designs. Tests culminated in the Trinity test on July 16, 1945, in the New Mexico desert, where a flash and a mushroom cloud confirmed that atomic energy could be weaponized at an unimaginable scale. Immediate reaction: the Trinity test convinced many scientists that the weapon worked, but not all agreed it should be used against cities. The window between Trinity and the first use was short. On July 26th, the Potsdam Declaration demanded that Japan surrender or face prompt and utter destruction. Japan's government, constrained by its military leadership and the imperial system, did not accept unconditional surrender. In late July and early August, diplomatic messages passed in code and through channels debating surrender terms. The U.S. government received reports suggesting Japan might seek conditional surrender, preserving the emperor, while military leaders read the situation as continued resistance. The American Joint Chiefs viewed the bomb as a way to end the war quickly. Key tension: the exact intentions of Japan's leadership in those final weeks remain debated. Washington concluded public bargaining would not produce the speed it wanted. On August 6th, Enola Gay dropped Little Boy over Hiroshima. Eyewitness accounts describe a blinding flash, a heat wave, and a rapidly rising cloud. The technical descriptions are many, but for survivors the experience was a rupture of normal life into sudden catastrophe. Hospitals, houses, and administrative buildings were pulverized or burned. Firefighters and rescuers were overwhelmed. The city's communications and infrastructure collapsed. Important to say, accounts vary on casualty counts and effects in the immediate hours. Historians work from incomplete records because the scale of destruction wiped out much of the documentation. Pause reveal. The weapon's effect was not only explosive, it fractured the capacity of civic life to respond. 3 days later, after learning the Soviets had now entered the war against Japan, the US dropped Fat Man on Nagasaki. Nagasaki was not the original target for that day, Kokura was, but heavy cloud cover forced the bomber to divert. The second strike compounded the shock. Japan announced its surrender shortly afterward, citing the devastating new weapon and the Soviet entry as factors. Controversy moment. Historians and participants still argue whether the Soviet invasion alone would have precipitated surrender or whether atomic strikes were decisive. The evidence supports both contributions. Survivors' testimony is crucial to understanding human impact. Many accounts speak of instantaneous loss, families, workplaces, entire neighborhoods gone in a moment, and of horror in the following days and weeks as burns, radiation sickness, and deprivation took lives. Medical staff who remained described hemorrhaging, hair loss, and infections consistent with radiation exposure. Later studies documented long-term cancer rates, genetic concerns, and social dislocation for survivors, Hibakusha, who often faced discrimination in the post-war years. Human detail. Survivors' accounts emphasize long-term suffering, health, social stigma, the trauma of losing entire communities, not just the initial blast. Ethical debates erupted immediately. Some scientists who had worked on the Manhattan Project, like Leo Szilard, had warned before the bombs were used and petitioned the US government to consider alternatives or demonstrate the weapon's power over uninhabited areas. Others argued that a demonstrative test might fail or not force surrender, making the risk unacceptable. Military leaders emphasized speed and certainty. Historians since then have examined the range of moral positions among scientists, generals, and politicians. Moral reveal. Many of the project's own creators feared the political and ethical consequences of using the bomb on cities. There are also arguments about alternatives that were available or feasible in summer 1945. Some have suggested a demonstration over an uninhabited island could have sufficed. Others point out that Japan's political structure made internal consensus on surrender difficult. Some elements were prepared to continue fighting even if the emperor favored surrender. The invasion planners argued that a demonstration might not be convincing, especially if the Japanese could portray it as a unique or non-repeatable event. The historical record is complex, and any assessment must weigh incomplete data, the fog of wartime decision-making, and the urgency felt by leaders who had watched 7 years of global conflict. Strategic reveal. No alternative guaranteed a rapid end without high casualties. That uncertainty weighed heavily in policy decisions. A geopolitical layer matters. The United States knew that post-war order in Asia and Europe would be negotiated amid emerging UdSSR Soviet rivalry. Some officials wanted to use the atomic bomb to shorten the war and, by doing so, limit Soviet territorial gains in East Asia. Others worried that demonstrating nuclear capability on a Japanese city would harden Soviet perceptions of American power and accelerate the arms competition. The result: atomic diplomacy entered the post-war equation immediately. Within months, former allies were trading barbs and building stockpiles. The onset of the Cold War was not a distant consequence, but an almost immediate one. Diplomatic reveal. The bomb was as much a bargaining chip as a weapon, and its use reshaped global politics. Exposure to radiation compounded suffering in the months and decades that followed. Immediate injuries were catastrophic. Later, survivors reported higher rates of leukemia and other cancers. The medical community's understanding of radiation effects evolved as researchers tracked cohorts of survivors. The long-term stories include not only health statistics, but the social struggles of survivors who sought recognition, compensation, and dignity in post-war Japan. The Japanese government and international organizations have studied and treated survivors, and the history of radiation medicine includes advances made under tragic circumstances. Public truth. The human cost continued for generations, complicating the moral ledger. The strategic calculus that produced the bomb decision reflected multiple intersecting logics: military planning to avoid invasion casualties, diplomatic calculations about Soviet movement, scientific elation and unease at the weapon's success, and political pressure to end a war that had consumed American attention and resources for 4 years. President Truman later said he wanted to end the war as quickly as possible and save American lives. Critics have responded that the decision also signaled a willingness to accept massive civilian casualties as a price of rapid victory, a point that remains at the center of ethical debates. Interpretive reveal: policy blends prudence with moral compromise. The consequences were immediate and enduring. What about legal and historical judgment? At the time, international law around aerial bombardment and civilian protection was less developed than in later decades. The Nuremberg trials created new precedents for wartime conduct, but decisions taken during active conflict were often judged in the context of military necessity. Over the decades, historians, ethicists, and legal scholars have debated whether atomic strikes constituted war crimes or tragic but legal acts of warfare. The debate reflects changing norms. What passes as lawful or acceptable in the aftermath of total war changes as peacetime institutions evolve. Legal reveal: the bomb catalyzed a rethinking of law, norms, and accountability in warfare. Cultural memory matters. In the United States, the bombs were often framed early on as instrumental to victory. In Japan, they became symbols of suffering and a cautionary tale about nuclear proliferation. Both memories are political, contested, and real. Cold War politics reshaped public narratives. In recent decades, declassified documents, survivor testimony, and new scholarship have enriched and complicated the story, showing multiple motivations and a diversity of perspectives among decision-makers. Memory reveal: narratives differ by nation, but evidence forces shared reconsideration. Contemporary implications are unavoidable. The bombs ended World War II, but they also inaugurated the nuclear age. Lessons learned in 1945 shaped deterrence theory, arms races, non-proliferation treaties, and global institutions intent on preventing nuclear catastrophe. The ethics of deterrence, preventing war by threatening unimaginable destruction, became a central pillar of Cold War strategy and remains relevant today as new nuclear powers emerge and technologies evolve. Modern reveal: the decision to use atomic weapons did not close a chapter. It opened a new era of existential stakes for humanity. Finally, the human stories remain essential. Survivors' testimonies, letters from soldiers, records from scientists, and diplomatic cables give texture to policy debates. They remind us that strategic decisions play out in human bodies, families, and communities. Any account that seeks to explain the bomb's use must include those voices: the politician weighing casualties, the general planning invasions, the scientist skeptical of use, and the civilians who bore the blast. The historical record now contains documents and testimony that historians continue to analyze. The public can read differing interpretations and must judge where the balance of evidence lies. Closing reveal: understanding 1945 means holding contradictory truths, military necessity and moral cost, scientific triumph and human tragedy, at the same time. This account can be read into a voiceover structured to hold attention. Begin with the short opening line, then move through the chronology: Manhattan Project, Trinity, Potsdam, Hiroshima, Nagasaki, surrender, interleaving survivor testimony, archival quotes from officials, and concise interpretive paragraphs. Every 2 to 3 minutes, insert a short, striking one-line reveal, an evocative fact or a pointed question to re-anchor the listener. The casualty estimates for invasion, the Trinity flash, the Soviet entry into war, the implosion versus gun design, survivor quotes, and the diplomatic angle vis-a-vis the USSR. Keep language direct, avoid romanticizing violence, and frame ethical claims as contested rather than definitive. End with a sober line: the bomb stopped one war and started another kind of history, and the decisions made in 1945 still demand scrutiny, remembrance, and debate.